The first thing that girl said to me was, "You have 5 minutes to get your junk out of this greenhouse." I was standing ankle-deep in potting soil in August of 1988, sweat running down my neck, trying to save a tray of tomato seedlings from the Maryland heat. She had one hand on the old glass door, a cigarette tucked behind her ear, white Reebok high tops on her feet, and the kind of confidence you only get when nobody in your life has ever made you pay for being rude. I looked up at her through the smudged glass and said, "Well, honey, this is a strange way to introduce yourself, but if you were selling Girl Scout cookies, I already bought some last week." She did not laugh. Her face tightened the way people do when they're used to getting a reaction and suddenly realize they are talking to somebody who has spent too many years dealing with fools to provide one. "My father says this land belongs to Cedar Hollow," she said, tapping the door with one bright red fingernail. "This whole greenhouse thing is on association property. You need to clear out before somebody gets hurt." Now, there are sentences a person remembers for the rest of her life, not because they are beautiful, but because they tell you exactly what kind of trouble has just walked into your yard. "Somebody gets hurt" was one of those sentences. I wiped the dirt off my hands on an old towel, stepped out from behind the potting bench, and looked at the girl properly. Her name was Heather Givens, though I did not know that yet. She was 20, maybe 21, tall and sharp-faced, with teased brown hair sprayed stiff enough to survive a hurricane. Behind her, parked half on my gravel drive and half in the grass, was a red Camaro with a cracked taillight and a cassette tape blasting Bon Jovi so loudly I could hear the drums through the greenhouse walls. 2 boys leaned against the hood, pretending not to look nervous. I had learned a long time ago that boys pretending not to be nervous usually meant someone had talked them into doing something stupid. "Your father have a name?" I asked. Heather smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Russell Givens, president of the Cedar Hollow Improvement Association. Everybody knows him." "Well," I said, opening the greenhouse door all the way, "I just moved here 4 months ago, so maybe everybody forgot to invite me to the parade." Her eyes narrowed. "You think this is funny?" "No," I said. "I think you are standing on my property, making threats in front of witnesses, and I think your father ought to be embarrassed." That was when she took one step closer, close enough for me to smell cigarette smoke and that sweet, powdery perfume young women wore in the late 80s, the kind that came in a frosted glass bottle and stuck to your curtains for 3 days. "My father does not get embarrassed," she said quietly. "He makes people leave." Then she turned, climbed into the Camaro, and drove off hard enough to spit gravel against my mailbox. I stood there for a while after she left, listening to the sound of that engine fade down the lane, and I remember thinking that the whole thing felt ridiculous. I was 47 years old. I had spent half my adult life around property records, zoning maps, forged signatures, fake deeds, and men who believed a loud voice could turn a lie into law. I had moved to Cedar Hollow because I wanted quiet. I wanted a little house with a porch, a garden, a place where nobody knew my name before I handed them a business card. I did not want another investigation. I did not want another ugly fight over land and money and people deciding they were above the rules. But standing there in that greenhouse, surrounded by tomato plants and basil and the old wooden workbench my father built with his own hands, I had a feeling I knew exactly how this was going to end. The trouble was, I had no idea how many people were already trapped inside it. Cedar Hollow Estates sat about 20 minutes outside Frederick, Maryland, tucked between a 2-lane highway and a stretch of old farmland that had not yet been swallowed up by subdivisions. In 1988, it was the kind of place people called charming when they were trying to sell you something. The houses were mostly brick ranches and split levels, all built in the late 60s, when families still thought a 3-bedroom home with a chain-link fence was the American dream. There were 63 houses, a small community hall, a cracked tennis court, nobody used, and the little wooded greenbelt that ran behind the homes like a strip of old country, trying to survive the suburbs. I bought my house from a woman named Ruth Bannon, who had lived there since Nixon was president and was moving to Florida to be near her daughter. The place had needed work. The kitchen cabinets were avocado green. The living room carpet smelled faintly of cigarettes and dog hair, and the porch railing leaned so badly to the left that my brother said it looked like it had been drinking. But the lot was big, nearly an acre, and at the far end of it sat a small greenhouse with a slanted roof and cloudy glass panes. It had been built sometime in the 50s, maybe earlier, and Ruth told me her husband used to grow roses in it. I stood inside that greenhouse on the day I signed the papers, sunlight coming through the dirty glass, and I thought, this is it. This is where I start over. You see, I had not always been the kind of woman who wanted to live alone with tomato plants. For 23 years, I worked for the Maryland Attorney General's office in a small division that investigated property fraud and consumer complaints. Most people thought that sounded exciting. It was not. Most of the time, it meant sitting in stale county offices reading stacks of paper while somebody lied to me with a smile. I had seen crooked contractors steal retirement money from widows. I had seen developers move boundary markers in the middle of the night. I had seen families lose homes because they signed documents they did not understand. After a while, it changes the way you look at people. You stop trusting anyone who says, "Don't worry about the paperwork." You start reading every line before you sign. And when my marriage ended after 17 years, not in some dramatic explosion, but in the slow, sad way marriages sometimes end, with too many quiet dinners and too many things left unsaid, I wanted to go somewhere nobody knew I had once been somebody's wife. I wanted to be June Halpern, the woman with the greenhouse and the old pickup truck, not Investigator Halpern from the Attorney General's office. So when I got to Cedar Hollow, I kept my job vague. If anybody asked, I said I worked for the state. That was true. It was also the safest answer I could give. The first time I met Russell Givens, he came to my front door carrying a peach cobbler and wearing a pale yellow golf shirt tucked into khaki pants that were just a little too tight around the waist. He was in his late 50s, maybe 60, with silver hair combed straight back and a smile that looked practiced. He was the kind of man who called every woman sweetheart until she disagreed with him, then suddenly called her ma'am. "Welcome to Cedar Hollow," he said. "I am Russell Givens, Association President. We like to make sure new residents understand how things work around here." I remember standing in my doorway holding that cobbler and thinking it smelled wonderful, but I would not have eaten it if he had paid me. He handed me a thick envelope with the association rules, bylaws, parking standards, paint color samples, lawn maintenance guidelines, and something called the Community Harmony Agreement, which sounded less like a neighborhood document and more like a warning from a small country with a dictator. "We keep a nice place here," he told me. "We have standards. People appreciate standards." "I like standards," I said. "They keep bridges from falling down." He laughed at that, but he did not really laugh. He made a little sound in his throat, like he was checking whether I was joking or dangerous. Then his eyes moved past me toward the driveway, where my old blue Ford pickup sat under the maple tree. "That truck yours?" he asked. "It is." "Commercial vehicle?" "Nope. It is a 1979 Ford that leaks oil and starts when it feels emotionally ready." That time, he did laugh. "Well, we do not allow work vehicles overnight. I'm sure it will be fine. Just something to keep in mind." He left after that, but not before looking past my shoulder toward the greenhouse at the far end of the yard. He stared at it just a second too long. I noticed. People forget that women notice things. We always notice things. We just do not always tell you that we noticed. The first few weeks in Cedar Hollow were peaceful enough. I painted the kitchen cabinets white, pulled up the old carpet, planted marigolds along the porch, and started fixing the greenhouse one pane at a time. I met the neighbors slowly. Mrs. Muth, Edna Pike, lived 2 houses down and had been in Cedar Hollow since 1971. She was 74, tiny as a sparrow, with gray hair twisted into a bun, and a voice like a screen door in a windstorm. The first time she came over, she brought me a pound cake and asked if I had a television. I said yes. She said, "Good, I need to borrow it if Dallas comes back on." That was Edna. She had a way of saying strange things, like they were perfectly normal. Across the street lived Ron and Lisa Torres, a young couple with a little boy named Danny, who rode a big wheel up and down the sidewalk until dark. Ron worked at the auto plant, Lisa worked part-time at a pharmacy, and they were always tired in that way. Young parents are tired. Like sleep had become a thing they had heard about once but could no longer remember. At the far end of the street lived Calvin Brooks, who owned a small garage in town and served as treasurer for the association. Calvin was quiet, polite, and always looked like he was carrying a problem in his back pocket. Then there was Heather Givens. I met her a week after Russell came by. It was 2 in the morning on a Tuesday, and my bedroom windows were shaking from music. I got up, put on a robe, and walked down the street following the sound until I found Heather's Camaro parked in front of her father's house, doors open, stereo blasting, 3 young people sitting on the hood drinking beer out of paper cups. Heather saw me coming and smiled like she had been waiting for somebody to complain. "Music bothering you?" she called. "No," I said. I just came over to see if the neighborhood was being invaded by a marching band. One of the boys laughed. Heather did not. It is not even late, she said. It is Tuesday, I said. Some people have jobs. She climbed off the hood and crossed her arms. My father runs this neighborhood. Nobody cares. That sentence stayed with me. My father runs this neighborhood. Not the board, not the homeowners, not the rules. My father. I could have reported it. I could have called the sheriff's office. I could have made a fuss. But I did what I had learned to do in government work. I made a note. Date, time, names, vehicle description. And I went home. By the end of my second month, I began to understand why people in Cedar Hollow got quiet whenever Russell Givens walked into a room. He had built a system, and it was not a complicated one. If you agreed with him, you were fine. If you questioned him, you got letters. First came polite reminders, then came citations, then came fines. Mrs. Miss Pike had been fined $75 because she painted her porch awning blue instead of approved neutral beige. The awning had been blue since 1974. Russell had signed the approval letter himself when he first became president, but somehow the records had disappeared. Ron and Lisa Torres had received a warning because Danny's plastic tricycle was sometimes left on the front walk. Calvin Brooks told me once, in a voice low enough that Heather could not hear from the next room, that Russell had fined a man named Walter Fields $300 because his wife hung laundry on a clothesline. Said it made the neighborhood look poor, Calvin said. What did Walter do? I asked. Calvin stared into his coffee. He paid. Why? Calvin looked up at me then, and I saw it. Shame. Because Russell said if he did not, they would put a lien on his house. I remember feeling a cold little weight settle in my stomach. The thing about bullies is, they rarely start with violence. They start with paperwork. They start with rules. They make people feel stupid for asking questions, then guilty for resisting, then scared of what will happen if they say no. By the time anyone realizes what is happening, the bully has already convinced everybody else that the bully is the only person who knows how to keep order. Russell Givens had been president of the Cedar Hollow Improvement Association for almost 5 years. During that time, he had filled the board with people who either owed him favors or were too tired to argue with him. He told everyone he was protecting property values. That was his favorite phrase, property values. He used it like a priest uses scripture. If someone wanted to paint their front door red, Russell talked about property values. If a family put up a basketball hoop, Russell talked about property values. If an elderly woman planted flowers he did not like, there it was again, property values. But what he really meant was this: do what I say. I had seen men like him before. The only difference was that most of them wore suits and sat behind desks. Russell wore golf shirts and drove a Lincoln Town car. One afternoon in early July, he came by while I was repairing one of the greenhouse windows. He stood at the edge of the yard for a while, hands in his pockets, like he was admiring the work. Looks nice, he said. Thank you. You planning to sell plants? Maybe give some to neighbors? Tomatoes, herbs, that kind of thing. You should be careful with that, he said. Association rules prohibit commercial activity. Good thing I am not opening a department store. He smiled, but I could see the little twitch in his jaw. June, there is something else. That greenhouse sits close to the greenbelt. We have been reviewing old maps. There may be some question about the boundary. I stopped what I was doing. There is no question. I have the deed, the survey, and the county plat. Well, those old records can be complicated. I used to work with old records, I said. They can be complicated. They can also be read. He did not like that, I could tell. He looked at the greenhouse again, then at the wooded strip behind it. There is a possibility the association may need access through this parcel in the future. Nothing major, just a small correction. A correction to what? The boundary. And what exactly is wrong with the boundary? He gave me a smile that was supposed to make me feel silly. We will discuss it later. Then he left. I watched him walk back to his Lincoln, and I knew I had just become a problem. 3 days later, I got my first letter from the association. It said my Ford pickup violated parking restrictions. A week after that, another letter arrived, saying the greenhouse was under review for non-compliant structure status. Then came a notice about an unapproved compost pile, which was funny because I did not have a compost pile. I had a pile of leaves behind the shed. But the real turning point came the day Heather showed up with the Camaro and told me to get my junk out of the greenhouse. That afternoon, after she drove away, I went inside, poured myself a glass of iced tea, and pulled the original property papers from the metal file cabinet in my office. I spread them across the dining room table. The deed clearly listed the greenhouse parcel as part of my property. The survey showed the line exactly where the old fence stood. The county plat showed no shared access, no greenbelt easement, no community right-of-way, nothing. I knew that much before I even put my glasses on. So I did something I had not planned to do when I moved to Cedar Hollow. I called my old friend Paul Morrison at the county records office. I did not tell him everything. I just asked if there had been any recent filings involving Cedar Hollow estates. Paul said he would look. Then I took a small Sony cassette recorder from my desk drawer, put fresh batteries in it, and set it beside the phone. I had learned something over the years. People will lie to your face. They will lie in meetings. They will lie in letters with their names typed at the bottom. But when they think nobody is listening, they sometimes tell you exactly who they are. The next morning, Russell came to my house with Heather. He did not knock. He walked through the side gate and into the backyard while I was watering the plants. Heather followed behind him, chewing gum and looking bored. Russell had a folded piece of paper in his hand. "June," he called. "We need to settle this. You could start by staying off my property," I said. "This is association business. This is my yard." He opened the paper. It was a photocopied map, black lines on grey paper, the sort of thing you could make at a copy shop for 10 cents a page. He pointed to the greenhouse. "This structure sits on what is designated as community conservation land." I looked at the map. Then I looked at him. Then I looked at him. "Russell," I said, "this map has the wrong street names, the wrong lot numbers, and the old playground marked in a location where there has never been a playground." His smile faded. "You are not qualified to interpret that. Actually, I am more qualified than you know." Heather rolled her eyes. "Just move your stuff, lady. It is a greenhouse, not the White House." "No," I said. "It is a greenhouse on my land, and both of you are trespassing." Russell took a step toward me. "You are being very uncooperative. The board can impose fines. We can take legal action. We can make things difficult." "You already have," I said. "Now you are just making it obvious." He stared at me for a long moment, then said something I will never forget. "People like you come into a neighborhood, think you can do whatever you want because you have a little education and a little money. Then act surprised when the community pushes back." I almost laughed because that was the best thing about Russell. He had taken all the damage he had done to people and built himself a story where he was the victim. "People like me?" I asked. "What kind is that?" Heather stepped forward. "The kind nobody wants here." Now I had been called worse. I had been called worse by men with bigger offices and better vocabulary. But there is something about a young person looking you in the eye and saying nobody wants you here that gets under your skin. It did not make me angry right away. It made me sad. I looked at Heather and thought, "What did your father teach you that made this sound normal?" Then I said, "You should both leave now." Russell gave a small laugh. "Or what? Or I will call the police." "Go ahead," he said. "Tell them the association president came to inspect association property. I will tell them a man carrying a fake map came into my yard and threatened me." His eyes hardened. "Be careful, June." "I am," I said. "That is why I am recording this conversation." I lifted the little Sony recorder from the flower pot where I had hidden it. Heather's face went pale. Russell's did not at first. He just stared at the recorder. Then he looked at me with a kind of hatred that was almost calm. "You have no idea what you are getting yourself into," he said. "No," I answered, "but I have a feeling you do." Part 2. The middle. The first person to come to my door after that was Edna Pike. She came over at dusk, carrying a covered dish and looking nervous enough to jump at the sound of a lawnmower. "I saw Russell and that girl out there," she said. "You should not have argued with him." What was I supposed to do? Hand over my greenhouse? Edna looked down at the casserole in her hands. "That is what most people do." I invited her in. We sat at my kitchen table, and for the first 10 minutes she barely spoke. She picked at the edge of the dish towel under her casserole and stared at the old clock on the wall. Finally, she said, "My husband built the blue awning." I knew which awning she meant. It ran over the front of her little brick house, faded blue with white stripes. "Harold put it up in 1973, she said. "He measured every board, twice. He was proud of it. After he died, Russell sent me a letter saying it was not approved. He fined me $75. I told him it had been there for 15 years. He said that did not matter because he was president now. She laughed then, but it was not a happy laugh. Can you imagine, president now, like he had been crowned? Why did you pay? I asked softly, her eyes filled with tears. Because he said if I did not, he would send inspectors around every week until he found something else. I am 74 years old, June. I live alone. I did not have the energy to fight a man who enjoyed making me tired. That was the moment something changed in me. Up until then, I had been thinking about my greenhouse, my property, my quiet life. But sitting across from Edna, watching her try not to cry over a blue awning her dead husband had built, I understood this was bigger than one parcel of land. Russell Givens had figured out how to make ordinary people feel alone. He had convinced them that fighting back was expensive, embarrassing, exhausting, and pointless. And because they believed that, he had become powerful. Over the next 2 weeks, people started talking. Not loudly, not all at once, but a few at a time, like water dripping through a crack in a wall. Ron Torres told me his car had been keyed after he questioned a special assessment fee. Lisa admitted they had paid $200 to the association because Russell claimed their front window curtains were too bright. Calvin Brooks told me Russell had been pressuring him to sign off on expenses he did not understand. Landscaping contracts, Calvin said. Consulting fees, maintenance charges. I asked to see invoices once. Russell told me I was overstepping. You are the treasurer, I said. That is literally your job. Calvin gave me a tired smile. I know. Then he looked down at his hands. But I have 2 kids. I have a shop in town. Russell knows everybody. He made it sound like he could ruin me. There were more stories. A couple on Birch Lane got fined because their teenage daughter kept a horse poster in her bedroom window. A retired teacher named Mr. Haynes had been threatened with legal action because he built a small ramp for his wife after her stroke. Russell called it an unauthorized exterior modification. A woman named Marla Benson told me Heather had thrown eggs at her house after Marla refused to let Heather borrow her car. When Marla complained, Russell told her she had no proof and suggested she stop accusing his daughter of things she could not prove. The worst part was that nobody seemed shocked anymore. They were angry, yes. Hurt, certainly. But shocked? No, this had been going on for years. Russell had just been doing it carefully, one family at a time, until people began to think fear was part of the monthly dues. Meanwhile, Heather got worse. The first thing she did was start driving past my house at all hours. She would lay on the horn, sometimes once, sometimes 3 or 4 times, then speed away before I could get outside. One morning, I found empty beer cans in my driveway. The next week, someone poured paint across the hood of my Ford. It was cheap, blue paint, the kind you could buy at Woolworths, and it took me half a Saturday to scrub it off. Then one evening, I came home from work and found the greenhouse door unlocked. Nothing had been stolen, but somebody had gone through every drawer in my workbench. My seed packets were dumped across the floor. My gardening gloves were in the sink. A framed photograph of my father, taken the year he built that greenhouse, was face down in a tray of dirt. That picture bothered me more than I expected. My father had died 11 years earlier. He was a quiet man, a carpenter, the kind of man who could fix anything except the things that hurt you inside. When I was little, he used to say, a place matters because you put your hands into it. Looking at his picture covered in dirt, I felt something rise up in me that was not rage exactly. It was resolve. There is a difference. Rage makes you reckless. Resolve makes you patient. I cleaned the greenhouse, replaced the lock, and then I started building a file. Every letter, every fine, every incident, dates, times, names, license plates. I took Polaroids of the paint on my truck. I took photographs of the greenhouse drawers. I wrote down the stories people told me and asked them to sign statements when they were ready. Some were not ready. I did not push. Fear has its own schedule. Around that time, my friend Paul from County Records called me back. He told me there had been several filings related to Cedar Hollow over the previous year. Nothing dramatic at first glance. A proposed access easement, a preliminary request for subdivision review, a handful of documents submitted by a company called Glenridge Development Partners. Who owns Glenridge? I asked. Paul paused. That is the interesting part. Publicly, nobody connected to Cedar Hollow, but the registered agent is a law office in Baltimore. One of the names on the paperwork belongs to Russell Givens' brother-in-law. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, cord stretched across the room, and looked out the window at the greenhouse. Suddenly, the map made sense. The fake boundary, the pressure, the threats. Russell did not want my greenhouse because he cared about community space. He wanted access through my property. Behind my land, beyond the old greenbelt, sat nearly 12 acres of undeveloped field. If a road could be cut through the edge of Cedar Hollow, Glenridge Development Partners could build a row of new homes. And if Russell had a financial stake in that development, my little greenhouse was standing in the way of a lot more money than I had imagined. The next day, I made a call I had hoped never to make from my own kitchen. I called my supervisor, Evelyn Hart, at the Attorney General's office. Evelyn had been my boss for 6 years, and she knew me well enough to hear the difference in my voice before I said a word. "June," she said, "what happened?" I told her everything, not the emotional version. Not at first. I gave her dates, names, documents, land records, fines, witness statements, maps. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You are too close to this to run it yourself." "I know, but you have enough for us to take a look." "I know. You need to stop investigating." That one was harder. "Evelyn, people are being hurt, and they will be helped better if we do this right. Do not make yourself the story." She was right. I hated that she was right, but she was. So I turned over everything I had to a team in Baltimore. They assigned a younger investigator named Daniel Keene, a good man with a bad tie and a nervous habit of rubbing his forehead whenever he read something crooked. He came to Cedar Hollow pretending to be a title consultant. Over the next 10 days, he uncovered more than I expected. Russell had been moving association funds through a maintenance company that did not actually employ anyone. The company had a post office box, a bank account, and a name that sounded respectable, but no trucks, no office, no employees. The money went from residence dues into the maintenance account, then into a consulting company connected to Glenridge Development Partners. There were forged board minutes, fake votes, altered plats, a series of letters threatening homeowners with liens that Russell had no authority to file. And there was something else. A handwritten note from Russell to a county zoning consultant asking what it would take to resolve obstacles with the Cedar Hollow access road. Daniel did not tell me every detail. He did not need to. I knew what it meant. Russell had not just been playing neighborhood president. He had been building a private little machine, one fine and one frightened neighbor at a time. Then came the Friday night that took the whole thing from ugly to unforgivable. I had worked late in Baltimore that evening, not because of the Cedar Hollow case, but because a contractor fraud hearing had run long. By the time I drove home, it was almost midnight. The air was thick and warm, and there was a storm somewhere out over the mountains, lightning flashing every few seconds behind the clouds. When I pulled into my drive, I knew something was wrong before I even got out of the truck. The greenhouse lights were on. I never left them on. I walked toward the back of the property, moving quietly. And the closer I got, the louder I heard the music. Hair metal, loud enough to shake the glass panes. Then I saw them. Heather, maybe 8 or 10 kids, beer bottles, cigarette smoke, laughing, dancing inside my greenhouse like it was a bar. Somebody had dragged my old patio chairs into the center of the floor. Somebody else had knocked over trays of seedlings. One boy was standing on my father's workbench with a bottle in his hand, yelling lyrics at nobody. I stayed in the shadows for a moment, and I will be honest with you. I was scared. Not because I thought they would kill me or anything like that. I was scared because I could feel the anger rising in me, and I had spent too many years watching people make permanent mistakes in temporary moments. So I did not walk in yelling. I went back to the house, called the sheriff's office, then called Daniel Keene. After that, I called Ron Torres. He lived close enough to hear the music. "Ron," I said, "I need you to look out your window and tell me what you see." He did. There was a long silence. Then he said, "Heather's car is there. Can you see who else?" "A bunch of kids." "June, do not go over there." "I am not." "Good, because Russell will make this ugly." I looked toward the greenhouse where somebody had just thrown a flower pot against the glass. "Ron," I said, "it is already ugly." The deputies arrived 20 minutes later. By then, most of the kids had scattered. Heather had been smart enough to get in her Camaro and leave before the patrol cars came down the street. But they left plenty behind. Beer cans, cigarette butts, a broken window, a smashed potting bench, my father's framed picture torn in half, and spray-painted across the inside wall in crooked black letters were the words, "Jet out." The sheriff's deputies took a report. One of them, a heavy-set man named Deputy Collins, looked at the damage and shook his head. "You know who did this?" he asked. "I have an idea. An idea is not much." "No," I said, "but by Monday, I may have more than an idea." What I did not know then was that I already had more. The little boy across the street, Danny Torres, had gotten a VHS camcorder for his birthday. His uncle worked at an electronics store and had brought home one of those big, shoulder-mounted JVC cameras that looked like you needed a construction permit to carry it. Danny had been sitting at his bedroom window filming the storm because he thought lightning looked cool on tape. He had caught more than lightning. He had caught Heather's Camaro pulling into my drive. He had caught Heather and her friends climbing over the side fence. He had caught her laughing while one of the boys pushed my potting bench over. And he had caught her standing in the greenhouse doorway, holding up a beer bottle and saying, "My dad says she will be gone by next week anyway." Ron brought me the tape the next morning. He did not want to. I could see it on his face. He was afraid of what Russell would do to his family. But Lisa had made up her mind. She stood behind him in the doorway, arms crossed, and said, "We are done teaching our son that adults should be scared of a man like that." That was when Ron handed me the tape. I remember holding it in my hands, that black plastic cassette, and thinking how funny it was that so much of a person's life could turn on something so small. A tape, a signature, a sentence, a person deciding they had been afraid long enough. Sunday afternoon, every house in Cedar Hollow received a mimeograph notice in their mailbox. Russell was calling an emergency association meeting Monday night at the community hall. The notice said the meeting concerned serious violations by a resident threatening the peace, safety, and property values of Cedar Hollow Estates. I read it twice. Then I poured myself a cup of coffee and laughed so hard I nearly cried. Russell had no idea what was coming. Or maybe part of him knew. Maybe that was why he had decided to go public. Men like Russell do not like private fights when they are losing. They bring in a crowd. They need witnesses. They need people to see them winning. He thought he was calling a hearing to humiliate me. What he was really doing was bringing every person he had frightened into the same room at the same time. Monday night, I got dressed slowly. I wore dark jeans, a white blouse, and the blue blazer my sister always said made me look like I was about to deny someone a bank loan. I packed a leather folder with copies of my deed, survey, county plat, Russell's fake map, the cassette recording, the Polaroids, the witness statements, and the VHS tape from Danny's camcorder. Daniel Keene had already told me that 2 state investigators and a pair of Maryland State Police detectives would be nearby. They would not come in until he gave the signal. I was not supposed to make a scene. I was supposed to let Russell talk. That was the plan. The community hall was packed when I arrived. Every folding chair was full. People stood along the walls. Someone had made coffee in a huge metal urn, and the room smelled like burnt grounds, floor wax, and nervous sweat. Russell sat at a long table in front with 3 board members. Calvin Brooks was there looking sick. So was Walter Fields, the man whose wife had the clothesline. Heather sat in the front row wearing a black leather jacket and enough hairspray to make a fire marshal nervous. She had a bandage on one hand, probably from the greenhouse window, and she kept looking over at me with that same smug little smile. Russell stood when I came in. "June," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Glad you decided to attend." "Would not miss it," I said. He smiled. "Good, we have a lot to discuss." I took a seat near the front. For a moment, I looked around the room. Edna Pike sat in the back, hands folded in her lap. Ron and Lisa Torres sat together, Danny between them, holding a little toy truck. Calvin would not meet my eyes. Nobody looked comfortable. That was the thing about fear. It makes people look smaller than they are. Russell began with the usual language: safety, standards, property values, community harmony. He spoke in that smooth, careful voice he used when he wanted people to forget he was threatening them. Then he clicked on an overhead projector. Up on the screen appeared a photograph of my house, then my truck, then the greenhouse, then a picture of me standing in the yard, taken from a distance, probably by Heather. "This resident," Russell said, pointing at the image like I was a criminal in a courtroom, "has repeatedly violated association rules, created a hostile environment for our leadership, refused lawful instructions regarding community property, and engaged in behavior that has made residents feel unsafe." There were murmurs. Some people stared at the floor. Heather leaned back in a chair like she was watching a movie. Russell clicked again. This time the screen showed his fake map. The greenhouse at 14 Cedar Lane sits on association conservation land. Miss Halpin has been notified repeatedly and has refused to comply. I raised my hand. He ignored me. In addition, he continued, she has operated an unauthorized gardening business, stored commercial equipment on the property, and made threatening statements to my daughter. Heather stood up right on cue. I will give her this. She had learned how to perform. She lowered her voice, looked down at the floor, and said, I was just trying to tell her the greenhouse was not hers. She got in my face. She said she would make me regret coming near her house. A few people gasped. I looked at Heather. She would not look back. My father has tried to be reasonable, she said, but she has been harassing us for weeks. Russell put his hand on her shoulder. Thank you, sweetheart. I know that was hard. Then he turned to the room. The board is recommending a $5,000 fine, removal of the greenhouse within 30 days, and legal action if Ms. Halpern refuses to comply. $5,000. The room went quiet. I heard someone whisper, Good Lord. Russell looked at me with that expression I had come to recognize. He thought this was the end. He thought he had boxed me in. Then he said, Ms. Munrells, Halpern, you may speak in your defense. I stood up, picked up my folder, and walked toward the front of the room. My knees were steady. My hands were steady. My voice, when it came, was steadier than I felt. Thank you, Russell. I do have a few things to say. He looked annoyed already. That gave me a little satisfaction. I set the folder on the table and opened it. First, let us talk about the greenhouse. I pulled out the deed. This is my deed, recorded with Frederick County. It includes the house, the greenhouse, and the land surrounding it. I held up the survey. This is the property survey from the sale. This is the official county plat. And this is a letter from the county planning office confirming that no portion of my property has ever been designated as Cedar Hollow Association land. Russell's smile did not vanish all at once. It shrank. Those papers could be misleading, he said. No, I said. They could be inconvenient. That is not the same thing. A few people laughed. Not many, but enough. I moved to the next stack. Now, about the claim that I have threatened Heather Givens. I set the Sony recorder on the table. This is a recording from the day Russell and Heather came onto my property and attempted to force me to surrender the greenhouse. Heather sat up straight. Russell's face went still. You recorded us? He asked. I did. Without permission, Maryland allows one-party consent, and as luck would have it, I was one of the parties. I pressed play. The room heard Russell's voice. We can make things difficult. They heard Heather's voice, the kind nobody wants here. They heard Russell say, Be careful, June. And they heard me tell them to leave my property. When the tape ended, nobody spoke for a few seconds. Then Edna Pike whispered, That is exactly how he talks. Russell turned toward her. Edna, do not start. It was a small sentence, but the whole room felt it. Do not start. Like she was a child. Like he still owned the air around her. I looked at Edna. Mrs. Pike, would you like to tell the room about your awning? Her face changed. Fear came first. Then embarrassment. Then something else. Something I had seen before when people finally realized they are not alone. She stood slowly, holding onto the back of her chair. He fined me $75 for a blue awning, she said. Her voice shook at first. My husband built it. It had been there 15 years. He said I had to pay or he would inspect my house until he found more things wrong. Russell shook his head. That is not what happened. It is exactly what happened, Edna said, louder this time. Ron Torres stood next. You fined us because my son's tricycle was in the yard. Lisa stood beside him. And you told us we should be grateful you did not report our curtains. Walter Fields got up. Then Calvin. Then Marla Benson. One by one, people started telling their stories. Not perfectly, not dramatically, just the plain exhausted truth. Fines, threats, calls, letters, warnings. Heather's parties. Damage to cars. Russell using the board like a weapon. The room changed as they spoke. You could feel it. The fear did not disappear all at once, but it began to crack. Russell tried to interrupt. He said people were confused. He said they were exaggerating. He said they were participating in a coordinated attack against him. But every time he spoke, another person stood up. Then I placed the VHS tape on the table. There is one more thing, I said. Heather's face drained of color. This was recorded Friday night. It shows Heather and several others entering my property, damaging the greenhouse and stating that I would be forced out of Cedar Hollow. Russell looked at Heather. For the first time that night, he looked afraid. "You do not have the right to show that," Heather said. "Actually," I said, "I have every right." The community hall had an old television on a rolling cart and a VCR used for showing safety videos at meetings. I slid the tape in. The image was grainy, shaky, and a little dark, but it was clear enough. Heather's red Camaro. The kids climbing the fence. The music. The beer. The smashed potting bench. And Heather, laughing, saying, "My dad says she will be gone by next week anyway." The room went silent. Heather stood so fast, her chair fell over. "That is not what it looks like," she said. "What exactly does it look like?" I asked. "It was a joke. You destroyed property. It was a party. You threatened me. You were not supposed to be there." I almost smiled. "In my greenhouse." She looked at her father. "Dad, say something." Russell opened his mouth, but no words came out. Then I closed my folder and looked around the room. "There is something else you all deserve to know." Russell stared at me. He knew. I could see it in his eyes. Maybe he had figured it out days earlier. Maybe he had always suspected. "When I moved here, I told people I worked for the state," I said. That was true. What I did not say was that I had spent the last 23 years investigating property fraud for the Maryland Attorney General's office. The room was so quiet I could hear the old wall clock ticking. Heather looked at me like I had turned into someone else. Russell's face changed from red to gray. "You set me up," he said. "No," I said. "I moved into a house, fixed up a greenhouse, and asked you to leave me alone. You made your own choices." I reached into my folder and placed a second file on the table. I did not investigate this matter myself. I reported it because I was personally involved. The Attorney General's office assigned an independent team. They reviewed the association records, the maintenance contracts, the land filings, and the financial transfers. At that moment, Daniel Keene stood up from the back of the room. He had been sitting there in a brown suit all night, looking like just another tired homeowner. Next to him, two men in plain clothes stood as well. Daniel walked to the front, showed his identification, and said, "Russell Givens, the state of Maryland, has obtained warrants related to suspected fraud, falsification of records, theft of association funds, and coercion involving property access agreements." Russell grabbed the edge of the table. "This is nonsense." Daniel did not blink. "The association paid more than $30,000 to a maintenance company that does not exist. That money was then transferred through accounts connected to Glenridge Development Partners. Glenridge has a pending development proposal that required access through Ms. Halpern's property." Somebody in the room gasped. Calvin sat down hard in his chair. "You were going to build a road?" he whispered. Russell turned toward him. "You do not know what you are talking about." Daniel held up copies of documents. "We also found altered board minutes, forged signatures, and false claims of community approval." Russell tried to laugh, but it came out thin. "It cannot prove I signed those." Daniel looked at him. "Your fingerprints are on the original documents. Your handwriting appears in the margin notes, and the bank deposits match the assessment collection dates." Heather began to cry then, not loudly, not dramatically. Just those quick, angry tears people cry when they realize the story they believed about themselves is falling apart. "Dad," she said, "you said this was about the neighborhood." Russell did not look at her. He looked at me. "You think you are better than me because you have a badge and a file folder." "No," I said quietly. "I think I am tired of watching people like you confuse fear with respect." That was when Heather snapped. She lunged toward the table, grabbed for the cassette recorder, and knocked over the coffee urn. Hot coffee spilled across the floor. People shouted. One of the detectives caught her arm before she got 2 steps. She fought him, screaming that I had ruined her life, that everyone was lying, that she did not do anything. I stood there watching this young woman who had threatened me in my own greenhouse, and I felt no joy in it. None. Just sadness. Because she had been taught that power meant getting your way. She had been taught that apologies were for weak people, rules were for other families, and if anything went wrong, her father would make it disappear. But fathers cannot make everything disappear. Not forever. Russell tried to leave through the side door. He actually tried to walk out while people were still shouting, like he could just slip away and start over somewhere else. One of the state police detectives stopped him before he reached the hallway. "Mr. Givens," he said, "you need to come with us." Russell looked around the room. At the board members, at the neighbors, at Edna, at Calvin, at Heather, crying in the arms of a detective. Then he looked at me. "You will regret this," he said. I took a breath. No, Russell. I will regret not doing it sooner. Part 3. The ending. The next few months were messy. Real life usually is after a moment like that. There was no single day when Cedar Hollow suddenly became peaceful. There were lawyers, meetings, paperwork, newspaper calls, and a lot of people trying to decide whether they had been victims, cowards, or both. Russell Givens was removed from the association board that same night. Calvin Brooks resigned as treasurer for a while because he said he could not stand looking at the books anymore. Later, after the dust settled, he came back and helped rebuild the finances from scratch. He was not a bad man. He was just a scared one, and I learned something important about scared people during that year. Fear does not always make people cruel. Sometimes it just makes them quiet. Heather was charged for the property damage and the break-in. Because she had no serious record and because she was still young enough to have a chance at becoming somebody different, the court gave her probation, restitution, and community service. She had to pay for the greenhouse repairs, the broken workbench, the plants, the windows, and the damage to my truck. She spent several weekends picking up trash along the county road in an orange safety vest. The first time I saw her doing it, I almost kept driving, but then she looked up, saw me, and walked over. It was late fall by then. Leaves were blowing across the road, and she looked smaller than I remembered. No leather jacket, no perfect hair, just a sweatshirt, work gloves, and dirt on her shoes. "June," she said. I waited. "I am sorry. I did not answer right away." "For what?" I asked. She looked down. "For the greenhouse, for the truck, for what I said, for acting like I owned things that were not mine." "Do you know why you acted that way?" She thought about it. "Because my dad always acted like everybody else was in the way. Like if they did not agree with him, they were stupid or against us." I nodded. "And what do you think now?" She looked out at the road for a long time. "I think I was mean because I thought it made me important." That was honest enough for me. Not complete, not perfect, but honest. "Being sorry is a start," I told her. "What you do next is the part that counts." Russell's case took longer. The state investigation showed that he had siphoned association money for years, manipulated fines, forged documents, and used the Cedar Hollow board to help a private development deal that would have made him a fortune. He eventually accepted a plea agreement. He paid restitution. He lost the house. He moved away before the following summer. I saw his Lincoln Town car loaded with boxes one morning, and for a moment I expected him to look at me. He did not. He kept his eyes on the steering wheel and drove out of Cedar Hollow without saying goodbye to anyone. The road he wanted to build through my property never happened. Glenridge Development Partners disappeared from the county records not long after the investigation began. Funny how fast business plans vanish when somebody starts asking for receipts. Cedar Hollow changed slowly after that. The first big change was the meetings. We started holding them every month, and people actually came. We published the finances. We voted on rules. We got rid of the ridiculous restrictions that had made people feel like prisoners in their own homes. Mrs. Pike kept her blue awning. Ron and Lisa let Danny leave his toys in the yard. Walter Fields put the clothesline back up for his wife, and the first time I saw sheets blowing in the breeze behind their house, I nearly cried. Not because of the sheets, because they were ordinary. Because ordinary things had become brave in that neighborhood, the greenhouse became a kind of symbol, which I did not entirely love at first. I had wanted it to be mine, just mine, a quiet place where I could grow tomatoes and disappear for an hour when life got too loud. But one Saturday the following spring, Edna knocked on my door and asked if I might show her how to grow basil. Then Lisa Torres asked if Danny could help plant sunflowers. Then Calvin offered to fix the broken bench. Before I knew it, the greenhouse was full of people. Kids with dirty hands, neighbors bringing coffee, somebody playing old Motown on a portable radio. And I realized that Russell had wanted control of that place because he thought ownership meant power. But real ownership, the kind that matters, is different. It is care. It is responsibility. It is knowing that something is yours and choosing to share it anyway. One evening in June of 1989, almost a year after Heather stood in my yard and told me to get out, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea and watched the neighborhood settle into itself. Danny Torres was riding his bike down the sidewalk. Edna was watering flowers under her blue awning. Calvin was grilling hamburgers in his backyard. Somewhere a radio played an old Bruce Springsteen song. The greenhouse lights glowed softly at the end of the yard, and inside, tomato vines climbed toward the glass roof. I thought about the first day I arrived in Cedar Hollow. I had wanted a place where nobody knew who I was. I had wanted to be invisible. But maybe that had been my mistake. Maybe silence protects you for a while, but eventually, silence protects the wrong people too. I still think about that. I still wonder whether I should have told everyone what I did for a living sooner. Maybe I could have stopped Russell earlier. Maybe Edna would not have paid those fines. Maybe Ron and Lisa would not have spent so many nights afraid of their own mailbox. Or maybe Russell would have hidden his tracks better. Maybe Heather would have acted nicer in public and meaner in private. Maybe the truth would never have come out clearly enough to hold up when it mattered. I do not know. That is the part people like to argue about. Was I right to wait until I had proof, or was I wrong to let the situation grow while I built a case? I know what I believe. I believe justice is not just about catching people. It is about making sure they cannot do the same thing to the next person. But I also know waiting has a cost. Somebody always pays while the truth is being gathered. So I want to ask you something. What would you have done if you were me? Would you have revealed everything the first time Russell tried to take the greenhouse, even if it meant he might cover his tracks? Or would you have waited, gathered the evidence, and risked letting the damage get worse before it got better? Tell me in the comments, because this is not only a story about one crooked neighborhood president or one spoiled young woman in a red Camaro. It is about what happens when good people get tired of being afraid, when somebody finally says enough, and when a whole community realizes that the person they feared was never as powerful as they pretended to be. And if you believe stories like this matter, share this video with somebody who has ever dealt with a bully, a dishonest boss, a controlling neighbor, or anyone who used fear to get their way. Because sometimes karma does not arrive with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it comes in a file folder, a VHS tape, and a room full of people who finally decide to tell the truth.